Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Wisconsin Ability Summit. We'd like to begin by thanking Manpower Group for being the virtual sponsor this year. I am Tracy Glorioso, Director of Operations at Experis, a Manpower Group company. I'm also very humbled to be on the board of Disability in Wisconsin. Please remember to keep your videos off and lines muted during this session. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please post them in the chat. To enable closed captioning, please refer to the document posted in the chat. We'd like to begin by recognizing our member organizations, starting with our charter members. Associated Bank, Wrangham, Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin, American Family Insurance, Old National Bank, Kalahari Resorts and Conventions, CUNA Mutual Group, and University of Whitewater. Next, with our sustaining members, Franklin Energy, GE Healthcare, Manpower Group, Rockwell Automation, Northwestern Mutual, ABB, Oshkosh, Trane Technologies, and Kimberly-Clark. On with our business and community members, Wallow Brands, Versatile Interpreting Services, Mindshift, My Choice Wisconsin, Easter Seal Southeast Wisconsin, Goodwill, MCFI, Best Buddies, and ERI. And finally, before we start the session, we'd like to talk about our sponsors for today's session. Old National Bank, Wrangham, Northwestern Mutual, Oshkosh, Franklin Energy, Trane Technologies, Kimberly-Clark, and Associated Bank, Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin, and CAI. Now we'd like to transition to begin our session. Let me introduce you to Dr. Bethany Lopristi, Executive Director of Behavioral Health, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry, Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin, and Hale Pulsifer, VP Customer Accessibility at Fidelity Investments.
Hi, Tracy, and hi to the group today. Thank you so much for having us. I'm so happy to be a part of this event and this discussion of such a relevant and worthy topic, especially right now in our world. Maybe the best place for us to start is by asking ourselves, what is wellness? Wellness is defined as the state of being in good health, but it's different from just being in good health in that it's an actively pursued goal. So this concept of wellness is set apart in that it involves many different areas of what makes our life fulfilling, including physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual, environmental, occupational, and social. So a lot of different elements going into this idea of wellness. As we talk today about mental wellness in the workplace, we're really acknowledging all of these areas of wellness, and we put a particular focus on probably the mental, emotional, and occupational areas, but it's very difficult to parse out just one area. So I want you to keep in mind all of the different elements that go into being well as we walk through. Next slide, please. The work that we do is so central to who we are. We often spend the majority of our waking hours engaged in our work. So it seems like a no-brainer that our mental wellness would extend to the workplace. And yet we still find that many organizations and employees see the two as sort of artificially separate. And that's really why we're here today, to discuss how to bring that balance to the workplace in a very accessible way. And to acknowledge our quest for that balance and wellness in our workplace, we have to acknowledge the struggle that we all feel at times to get to that balance. And when this mindset is supported in our workplace, we see that it is a more productive, more satisfied place to work. People are more committed to their work. And we want to talk about some of the elements that go into that. We all know what absenteeism is and what a problem it can be when a workforce is unwell. But just as disturbing is known as presenteeism, which is pushing through when a person is not well. And we see that a lot. Multiple studies highlight the poor outcomes of a workforce that does not embrace wellness among their employees and leaders. And when a workplace struggles we know that there are significant financial losses to the organization and a number of negative health outcomes for the employees. The environment in which we work plays such a significant role in how we cope with life, both at work, but also outside of work. A Norwegian study of nurses demonstrated that nurses who had high levels of psychological hardiness, or what we might term resilience, showed a decrease in that hardiness after exposure to chronic bullying on the job. And this was defined as being in a situation where they were exposed to negative attitudes and behaviors and felt that they couldn't escape this situation. Moreover, the study replicates trauma studies that show that with chronic exposure to this type of negativity, we actually see changes in that resilience, both at work, but also in our personal lives. And it actually increases the risk of future trauma and victimization overall. So essentially, a negative work environment can wear away even the strongest armor. There are also a number of studies demonstrating that mental wellness hinges on the ability to balance our personal and professional lives. And we've seen this really challenged in the past several months with families working and schooling from home and just. But keep in mind, even pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, this was never easy for families. And it becomes much more difficult when a workplace is not acknowledging that struggle and promoting wellness among their employees. To demonstrate even further this linkage between our overall wellness and our work, studies show that when a workplace does not support employees' mental and emotional wellness, we see poorer health outcomes overall, including many that are related to unhealthy coping strategies, such as obesity and addictions. And these, of course, in the end, lead to more absenteeism, less satisfaction with work and life, and just overall lower productivity in our workforce. So in sum, mental wellness does not stay at home when we go to work every day. And we have to applaud the organizations who are recognizing this and making their workplaces safer, real, and human. Next slide, please. I always like to use some real examples to make the experience a little bit more relatable, just a little more real. And I'm lucky that as a clinical psychologist, I've had the privilege of learning more about the clients and the individuals who I work with than might be apparent to others. And so I want to share with you 3 stories today, quick stories. And I'll encourage you to consider the significant differences in these 3 individuals as we think about their stories and just how their environment shaped how things turned out for them. The first story is that of a full-time student who is in her mid-20s at the time that I worked with her in a clinical setting. She was working part-time at the Salvation Army to put herself through school. She was a senior in college at the time, finishing her degree in education. She was also fully blind since birth and had experienced severe, complex, and chronic trauma and abuse while growing up. When I initially heard her story, my own assumptions got in the way of her work on wellness. So I initially thought that our therapeutic work would certainly need to include trauma processing and potentially some work coping with her blindness as she made her way in her new profession. Within a couple of sessions with her, however, I realized that her balance of these factors that made up her personal wellness were actually in a very different place. It took a little convincing, but I realized pretty quickly that she had truly processed her trauma and coped very well navigating her new environment. So the 2 assumptions that I had were actually quite wrong. She specifically asked for what she needed. She needed help with vocational challenges and with building her social and recreational wellness. So many times people are able to tell us exactly what it is they need. And sometimes as a mental health professional, we tend to read in too much. And so what I needed to do was see past my assumptions in order to really hear what she needed to be well. The second story is that of a new police officer. In his first week on duty, this officer was called to investigate a missing toddler, and he was shocked to find that the boy had drowned in a stream on the property. This officer, who was a young father himself, was appropriately traumatized by this experience, and yet felt that he couldn't tell anyone fully about his struggle. There was an unspoken yet very clear policy in his department that kind of told him to toughen up and deal with it, and sent a very strong message of, this is the job you signed up for. And the end of the story is that he worked for another decade as an officer, actually a little more than a decade, trying to ignore the trauma of that early experience, as well as other experiences that had compounded the trauma over the years. And he ended up coping in less than optimal ways, had very low job satisfaction, high levels of chronic stress, and eventually, and probably healthy for him, left the field of law enforcement altogether. The third story is that of a friend of mine, actually, a mid-career nurse who very much enjoyed her work, despite it being a stressful job, and sometimes struggling with the balance of family and work life. She recognized that she was drinking in excess to cope with the stress, and in response, she immediately met with an EAP counselor at her workplace. In the process, she was able to acknowledge her alcohol addiction. It was probably longstanding, but had really risen to the surface in response to the COVID pandemic and the additional stress that came along with that. Because she worked in an environment that supports wellness, she was able to immediately and surprisingly openly take leave to seek treatment for her substance use disorder. After a brief leave, she's back on the job, has learned to cope with stress in more adaptive ways, enjoys her work and her personal life even more, and has even since been promoted. So a lot of good can happen when we just recognize what's going on and what it means to be human in or outside the workplace. And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of the openness of our workplace to support that quest for our employee wellness. Next slide, please. The support that an organization embraces as part of their culture cannot be understated. It's imperative to the outcomes in their workforce. We'll talk a little bit more about the steps required along the way, but these slides really speak for themselves when we look at the results of this study, and it comes to us from Accenture from the UK. On each of these dimensions of wellness, the experience of mental health challenge, ability to cope with stressors and challenges both inside and outside the workplace, we see huge differences in the responses of people who work for less supportive in less supportive environments versus those who work in environments that support mental wellness. If you look at the numbers on the right, you see there's a 40% decrease in recent mental health challenges in more supportive organizations, and significantly more endorsement of healthy coping and positive attitudes about work in those organizations that acknowledge and support our mental health. These are the organizations that are really openly having these conversations. Next slide, please. And when we look at some of the important factors making up supportive organizations, we see that a primary distinguishing factor is the attitudes and openness of their leaders. In more supportive organizations, we see leaders who are visible in having the conversations and supporting those with mental health challenges, leaders who are open, warm, and human when it comes to employee mental health, and those who are available and approachable and show genuine care for their employees' well-being. I think this is probably no surprise to this group, but it's really clear from this data that the key to a supportive organization is the leaders, and leaders who are secure enough to talk about mental health challenges and truly acknowledge and support the humanity of their team. So I will at this point kick it over to Hale to continue our discussion.
All right, thank you so much. I love that table setting because it shows us what the opportunity is to get this right. And I'd like to transition now into, well, how many people are we really trying to get this right for? And one of the research out of Johns Hopkins is quoted on the slide here that about 26% or 1 in 4 adults suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. And the word suffer is in there. That's not an inclusive word. We tend to avoid that word in the disability community. Although speaking from direct personal experience with mental health, it often does feel like suffering when I'm experiencing a mental health event. So I'll let it slide. But that's the stat, 1 out of every 4 of us. And that, of course, is in a typical year. But it's more than just 1 in 4. And research from Accenture points out, research from Accenture points out that it is way more than 1 in 4. To summarize briefly the slide that we're looking at, on the left side, it is people who are having a direct mental health lives. Is either multiple symptoms of a mental health condition or consideration of suicide, for example. That's on the left. On the right are people who are very close to those who are directly experiencing symptoms, close in a way that their routine is being disrupted by this, whether it's a family member or a close colleague, they're impacted too. And if you take those two populations and you put them together as a Venn diagram, you're looking at 92% of the population is directly impacted or indirectly impacted by a mental health event at some point in their lives. So put another way, even though statistically at any given time it's 1 in 4 people, nearly all of us, without exception, nearly all of us are impacted by this. And it's important that we're prepared for that moment when it happens. And that's part of what we want to talk about today. So that's the Accenture research. And then Disability In put out a deck earlier this year, some materials that I have leveraged liberally within my organization, and I love sharing with others because it's so impactful. Their conclusion is that when employers recognize this and they create a culture that supports mental health, workers are more likely to speak openly, to know where to go for help or advice, and they are more than twice as likely to love their jobs. So now I feel like we're transitioning. Yes, this is about mental health inclusion and productivity, but who doesn't want to work at a place where your colleagues are twice as likely to love their jobs? I mean, that sounds like a great place to work, right? Don't you want to be surrounded by energy like that? So there are also second degree benefits, not just directly benefiting from a robust mental health program, but also being surrounded by people who love their job and love going to work. And all of this research that we're talking about was in 2019, right? And we could go into all of the awful things that have happened this year and are continuing to happen. But the way I like to measure it is, this is a statistic that was brought to mind by Megan Lawrence. Or what the CDC reports is that the baseline for reported cases of generalized anxiety disorder is about 8%, and that was throughout 2019. And by the time we reached summer 2020, 36%. And to save you the math, that is a 4.5 times increase of people identifying as having generalized anxiety disorder. So this is now so much bigger than just the services to benefit those of us who have a diagnosed permanent mental health disorder. There's so many of us drifting into this space this year because of how challenging this year has been. So this is now more important than ever before. So as a result, companies today that are noticing this, whether it's through surveys or statistics or whatever they're studying, they're asking, well, who's really, oops, excuse me, I just accidentally turned several slides at once. Who is really good at this today? And who is really good at this before 2020? Because we want to study them and we want to learn from them, just like an architecture student will study buildings. So the next portion of this presentation is going to be grounded in some research that I have done personally based on colleagues that I have met primarily through Disability:IN, I will say, and then some other independent research. I also have to pause here and say that what I'm about to share is not, even though I am employed by Fidelity Investments, this is not officially Fidelity thought leadership. This is just what I've discovered in my journey trying to understand what mental wellness looks like when it's done really well at companies. So we'll just go through a few of these examples quickly. I'm leading with my favorite, EY. And a program that my friend Lori Golden helped build over there is called simply Are You OK? Four letters that are as informal and welcoming as a text you might receive from a friend. And so right out of the gate, I love the branding of it because it's inviting us all to think about this not as a corporate initiative, but like a really personalized, personal, intimate program. And that's how you need to start the conversation about mental health. There's a few things they did effectively. One was storytelling from senior executives. So some of the most respected and accomplished people in the firm opening up about their direct personal experience with mental health. And what that does is it creates a culture of safety. And if you've ever seen somebody publicly come out and say, I have experienced depression, or I have PTSD, and they talk about that openly, there's a culture of safety that follows that. And now you don't feel like you're going out on a limb. On the other hand, if leadership were to say, all right, everybody please tell us what your mental health conditions are so we know how to help you. I wouldn't feel safe disclosing in that environment. It's really important that leaders lead in this regard. Another thing they did to smash stigma, and this was just beautiful, is they positioned the benefits of this program not as some of us are struggling and we want to help them. They positioned it this way. We all want to get back to full productivity as efficiently as possible. So think about a time in your career where you've been fully productive, like on a highly functional team, and you're getting stuff done and you feel efficient and you get it, your manager gets it. That's an awesome feeling. Well, what they said at EY is that we want to maximize that experience for everybody in a healthy way. And if you are experiencing a mental health event, which is very, very normal, and they put the statistics out to back it, what's the shortest distance between where you are now and getting back to full productivity? Is it, per the use cases earlier, is it, well, suck it up and see if you can figure it out? Like, no, I can tell you from personal experience and also from Bethany's use cases, that's not the answer. You can't pretend it's not happening. It's something that is happening and it has to be addressed and treated if you're going to get better, if you're going to get back on your feet. And again, I'm speaking from direct personal experience here. I'm not speculating on this. So if the shortest distance between wherever you are now and full productivity is being open about it and knowing that you can be open to a manager who has training in this and that your manager is not going to discriminate you or hold you back from other opportunities because of this. And in fact, your manager has been deeply trained in creating a culture of psychological safety for you to be honest. That's just awesome. And furthermore, there was all this marketing materials and everything around so that people would be reminded anywhere from 5 to 40 times a day that EY is a place where it's okay to step forward and say, I'm struggling here. I'm having a mental health event, and whether it's temporary or permanent, you know that it's an okay place to be. They had all kinds of trainings, some for leaders, some for colleagues, some for team members, because they're all impacted a little bit differently. And of course, they didn't do this on their own. They partnered with thought leaders at mental health organizations and deeply with their own disabilities, ERG. To me, this is an example of a best-in-class mental wellness program. So that happens to be my favorite. There's a link here at the bottom of the slide, and I believe everybody has the slides that has the details of the full study if you'd like to read more. The next example is at, I think, did I skip a page? No, the next example is at AT&T, again, another large US company. And what I learned when looking at what they've done, and this information is a couple years old, so if there is someone here from AT&T and you have something more current, we might ask you to chime in at the end of the session. But they destigmatize it by making it an annual campaign to raise awareness, because there's turnover all the time. You can't have a one-time shot and then say, okay, now this is part of our culture. It's refreshed every year. And they also, that fourth bullet point, they talk about this outside of the firm. So if you happen to know somebody who works at AT&T and that's struggling, you may have seen this, and you can encourage them as a supportive friend to to avail yourself of some of the resources they bring. And I don't know what record-setting results means. I like the sound of it, but that's their language. Toyota. So Toyota, I can't say whether Toyota is the first company to do this, but they're the first company that I heard publicly do this in a room full of lots of other people from lots of other companies. And what they talked about are the side effects of people shifting into a night shift. So obviously, if you're a car company, there's a lot of pressure to be open 24/7, and that means somebody's got to be working in the middle of the night. And they noticed an uptick in unfortunate events, divorce, substance abuse, depression, absenteeism. If they were measuring presenteeism, as Bethany referred to earlier, I'm sure there would have been an uptick in that too. And rather than do the suck it up approach, Toyota just said, we've got to do something about this. And they created a project called the Blue Elephant Project. And it's similar in many ways to some of the others we've been looking at. But the culture at a place like Toyota, and you're talking about a plant, and the culture of a place like EY, are very different cultures, very different lifestyles. But despite their differences, they are still doing the same thing. They are saying, this happens and it's normal, and let's do whatever we can to make people realize that we're here for them. We're not just going to toss them into the fire. We're going to present as many supportive resources as possible. Bloomberg is a company that had a similar revelation as Toyota, but instead of it being night shifts, what Bloomberg discovered is that as they were rotating their leaders around the firm, these are youthful, high potential associates, and they get sent to London or other parts of the world. And what they found is that when somebody was sent overseas and they were taken out of their community and displaced from family and friends, as well as the hobbies that might be, more regional in nature than global, that they had a tendency to experience mental health events. And again, rather than say, we've got to cover this up or we've got a problem here, they just leaned right into it. And they said, and they made it part of the orientation, so you're going to be going overseas. You should be aware that maybe even if you've never had any experience with anxiety or depression or anything like that, it's a possibility you might experience some symptoms like these. And then they gave them the list. And if that happens, we want you to know it's okay, and we're here to help, and we're here to help in these ways. And then they offered all those resources too. Again, getting rid of the stigma. As you can see, there's an evolution happening here where discussions about mental health are really evolving from that list of things that you don't talk about in the workplace, like divorce and politics and alcoholism and all that, to things that no, please talk about it because it's happening to all of us and we're all impacted and we want to help. Okay, so those are some specific companies, and then there's all these people, all these guys. It's not gender inclusive to say all these guys, but it's just sort of fun with this slide because there's so many names on here, whether you are leaders in US business as shown on the left, and if you're following along at home, all of these names and logos have alt text so they can be spoken to you. But it's ADP, Levi's, Walgreens, like these are leading US companies, Bank of America, Cigna, and these massive research partners, Tufts University. I mean, there's too many on here to list. But they all came together recognizing that there is a need in the US, and they came up with something called the One Mind Initiative. And there's links here for it, and it's dedicated to improving mental health in the workplace. And they just get together and they share their goals and their learnings and their fears and their best practices, their ideas, and they all walk away better for it. And just last fall, so perfect timing, right? Fall 2019, right before 2020, they published a study, and there's a link to it here as well, on mental health initiatives at the leading firms in the US. So they started sharing what they had learned in their work together broadly and publicly so everybody else can benefit from it too. I love that kind of collaboration and sharing, especially when it comes to something like this, where so many of us and so many of our employers understand that this is an opportunity, but don't necessarily know how to go after it. And then there is another organization called Mental Health First Aid. The Mental Health First Aid will simply, they will administer training for you. They will come to your organization virtually, of course, these days. And when they do, they give you basic training on how to respond to a mental health event in the workplace.
Hey, Eric, it's Amy Rock. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Hey, Amy, can you mute your phone, please?
Oh,
Thank you. So with mental health first aid, they will come and they will give you basic training on how to respond to an event. Now, to be clear, they do not train you to be as qualified as a first responder, for example. But what they is shatter some of the fears that we all have that are perfectly natural. You know, what if you do come across somebody at work who you have a close friendship with and they open up to you about being really down and having suicidal thoughts? There's so many ways we can respond to that, and some of them are actually destructive, even though they seem like they're helpful. And that's the kind of thing that they educate you on. I love their motto: let's make mental health first aid as common as CPR. So anyway, this is another really good organization. Continuing along, let's see, my slide should be advancing. There we go. So with that covering the mental health first aid, I'm going to pause for a second and hand it back to Bethany to talk about a similar concept of psychological first aid.
great. Thanks, Hale. Yeah, I think that this couldn't be more relevant in 2020. We talk about, so many people are talking about how awful it is, and it's certainly been full of challenges, but I think also an opportunity to really learn a lot about how we respond psychologically. I'd like, as we think about how this situation has really intensified the needs of our workforce, I'd like to highlight my own organization, Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin, and how we've responded. In the midst of the pandemic, there's been no group, I think, more in need of psychological first aid than our frontline healthcare workers. And at Froedtert and the Medical College, I would say, had a pretty solid start and certainly a strong commitment to creating that culture of wellness and support in our workforce. But we learned so much as we navigated how to provide that support to our staff during this difficult time. So even though we started out with some great elements of a supportive workforce, in fact, we have a great peer support program that was founded pre-pandemic by some of our innovative physicians. We call it SOS, or Support Our Staff. We also have been piloting an on-site EAP counseling program, having a counselor right at our hospital and able to deploy as needed for crises and one-on-one work. And in addition, when the pandemic hit, our behavioral health groups developed very quickly, got together and developed both one-on-one and group support counseling and behavioral health services, and fast tracking our staff and those in need to the resources that they need. One of the first things we did is cataloged all of these resources and had them printed up on a pretty flyer and posted it everywhere we could. And as you might imagine, utilization of those resources was pretty low. For some programs, zero. We had to really step back and look at what do our staff need? We needed to really listen. And so what we did then is deploy a small group of peer support volunteers from that support program to round in those high acuity COVID units to bring resources personally, as well as gather both quantitative and qualitative data about what they needed. And we learned some really key lessons in terms of developing a program of support accordingly. First and foremost, psychological first aid is a very powerful tool in times of crisis. However, we need to be cautious that with our good intentions, we don't miss the mark on what our employees really need. So psychological first aid emphasizes the basics that we need to have in place for healthy coping through a trauma. And those basics include connectedness, building hope, really emphasizing calming and restorative activities, and efficacy and safety. People need to really very deliberately build these things into their life when we're dealing with a trauma like this. Essentially, what we're doing is focusing on controlling those factors that we are able to control when we're in a period of time or a situation where there's so much uncertainty or so many factors that we can't control. So recognizing that the pandemic is definitely more complex than even a typical disaster, if you can even use that term, we really had to look at this in creating that model for support for our staff. Next slide, please. We also learned that, in kind of going back to our earlier discussion, learned that adequate behavioral and emotional support really relies on the organizational and leadership support and communication. And so a significant part of our plan for providing that support to our healthcare workers is the coordination of feedback from our staff to our leaders and vice versa, so that we know very clearly what the concerns are of our staff without making assumptions, back to our earlier examples, and addressing those concerns fully. So we formalized the peer support volunteer program to round in person to all of our inpatient units and structured it in such a way that we were able to kind of mediate those important messages and the information that our healthcare workers and specifically nurses needed their leaders to hear, and communicating back from the leaders to the staff. And so the transparency of our leaders has been essential in the support that they're providing for their staff. What we've learned is that as a group, healthcare workers can handle a lot if they know that they're part of a cohesive team and they understand the why that's associated with what's going on. So clear communication between leaders and staff in this case, and really outlining the plan, the measures taken, really imparts that feeling of being valued and supported, rather than feeling, and I think this is a very real risk, feeling dispensable or unsupported during this very critical situation. Hale, next slide, please. And we also need to recognize that the needs change as we shift through different phases of this trauma. They shift from shock, fear, grief to more tangible concerns. And so when we look at some of the other important messages that we've learned, is really keeping an eye on the fact that this is dynamic, and kind of similar to what Hale had said earlier. We don't just plug in a formula and say, okay, good, we've got that taken care of. We need to keep in mind these main lessons learned, in that we have to keep that clear communication open. We need to make sure that messages are kept confidential. We need to recognize that the stressors are significant, they're dynamic, they're changing, and we need to really listen for that reason. And then can't emphasize enough the importance of having multidisciplinary teams in our healthcare setting that continue to provide those on-site support services to our healthcare workers and really ensure that they're being responded to in a timely manner. I think that, it allows us to fill in, there's this concept of moral injury, and it really involves, especially for healthcare workers, when they feel like the factors that are typically under their control, things that they can do to make a situation better, are no longer working, or are very variable, as is the case in the pandemic. It sort of deflates a person personally and professionally. And one of the things that we've learned is that we're able to, as an organization, fill in, I think, some of what is lost with that moral injury by together creating purpose, meaning, and direction, and really even just a sense of, like, we may not know all the answers, but we're figuring this out together, and we hear you. And that communication is so important. So as leaders, I think sometimes we feel like we have to have all the answers in order to communicate clearly and be supportive. But in fact, there's a lot of value in just opening up the conversation. So I'll kick it back to you, Hale. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. I want to sort of step out of the presentation for a second, just to comment that the whole exercise of this talk and preparing for it and getting to know Bethany and has been so, like, fulfilling and fun for me. And just to illustrate that, what you just heard is, like, here's how you design a program and here's how you execute a program, because that's where Bethany has direct experience. I have no experience like that. just so there's no misunderstanding about my qualifications, I am an end user of mental health services, and I'm a huge fan of anything that will reduce stigma in the workplace. And I'm willing to stake my sort of career and public reputation on that, because until we get rid of that stigma, the way so many of these awesome examples have, until we get rid of that stigma, people will simply remain too afraid to have the conversation, much like for years I was too afraid to have the conversation. And even though I was the global co-chair of a disability ERG that had 7.5% of our 55,000 employees as members. And even though I was in that position and I learned that depression, that major depressive disorder and ADHD were considered disabilities, I didn't accept that they were disabilities. I was much more comfortable saying to myself, no, they're not real disabilities. It's just something about me that's broken, and let's not talk about it. And we shouldn't talk about this kind of thing at work. You know, this isn't a real disability. And shame on me for allowing myself to believe that for so long. And it wasn't until I saw some very brave people, including Liz Taub from Disability In, very publicly talk about her experience. And that sort of changed my perspective on this, because hearing her open up about her experience had such a powerful impact on me that I started thinking, I'm going about this thing the whole wrong way. I need to lean into this, because it might be helpful to others the way Liz and Disability In have been helpful to me. And by example of that, I can't show you how to launch a program, but I can share a resource that I found invaluable in articulating my direct experience with mental health events in the workplace. So what you see on the screen is the screenshot of some content that Disability In put together earlier this year. There's a link to it. It's already been pasted in chat, but it's also on the slide. And I want to show you precisely how I used this content. I should say, first of all, it's full of awesome stuff. There's like 20 plus pages that, if you know anybody who is an inclusive leader, or if you are aspiring to be an inclusive leader, or you're creating a culture of psychological safety on your team, which is critically important to have everybody be at their best and to be a high functioning team. There is so much good stuff in this deck. I can't say that enough. But what I took from it explicitly, I'll share now. This is a slide that said, here's what the experience with depression is like. So rather than me looking for a book that explained it, or trying to put it together in my own words, I could simply say, there's two sides of it. There's behavioral and there's physical. And then we actually looked at this slide together, and I said, these are the things that happen to me: withdrawal from others, neglect of responsibility, loss of interest in personal appearance. Like these things, this is what happens to me. And then physically, like the fatigue and the weight loss. And yes, so I experience this, and when it comes, for me, it's about 10 days or so, sometimes 6 days, sometimes longer. But it's only a couple times a year generally, so it's not all that often. But when it does, it's important that I let you know what's going on, because if I don't, you're going to wonder, what the heck is wrong with Hale? Because that's what I'm thinking when this happens. I'm thinking, I can't be relied on. I am undependable. People are counting on me and I'm not there for them. And trust me, those are horrible, horrible feelings to have to feel, especially if they're not true. They're only temporary. These other two slides I thought were awesome. The first one is what to say. So I encourage you to hold on to this if anyone ever approaches you and you're not prepared. And they open up about a mental health event. These are among some of the most supportive things that you can say and the most appropriate ways to respond. And I'm very pleased to say that when I had this conversation with my manager before she even saw this page, out the previous page, she said the thing on the right in the dark gray: how can I support you? How can we support you? So like she gets it, right? It was so refreshing to know that I could, I just felt liberated to be myself. And I also felt more productive, more loyal to the organization, more appreciated. So here are the things of what not to say. And equally valuable to what to say is what not to say. Let's see, page down if it works this time. Okay, I'll do it with the mouse. What not to say. Some of this stuff as you read it will look very obvious. Everyone feels that way sometimes. You know, shake it off, and why are you acting so weird? And those sound like cold-hearted things. But I would also suggest that people who are best friends and care for one another say things like this to each other all the time out of support. And it's their way of saying, I notice something's off and we're really informal, so I'll just say whatever comes to mind. So, you know, in the context of this discussion, we can look at these word choices and say, oh gosh, I would never do that. But a lot of us have and do. So this is also a very useful slide, to share. So let's start wrapping things up. What can we do now with this? We've got this information. We've got some examples of what companies are doing really, really well. Please, we encourage you to treat 2020 like an opportunity, because that's what it is. More of us are experiencing mental health events than at any other time in my lifetime. And it's having a deep impact on all of us, much more than just those of us who have a permanent condition. This is applying to everybody who is struggling in this era. And as we saw earlier, it's about 4.5 times the typical baseline. So think about how to go back to your organization and take a stand. To demonstrate the values of inclusion and how to show sincere interest. Fight misconceptions, because there is by default a stigma around this unless those of us on this call, unless we choose to break it. Because if we don't choose to break it, nobody else will. So and I find the most effective way to break it is just to bring thought leadership like this back to your organizations. Show them some of the logos of the companies that are in here. These are what the best in class firms are doing. And look at all these companies that are getting together and sharing their research and best practices. Like, do we want to be on the sidelines while all these places are turning into better employers and better cultures? No, let's do this. That can be very motivating, especially for executives who miss out on a critical opportunity. And even if after that people are shy, your leaders at your firms are shy about, I just don't know about this, like it's a third rail, maybe we shouldn't go there. Slides like this, which is just a name dropping slide of about 30 or so celebrities, famous athletes, news people, I mean, you name it, these are people who have come forward publicly and shared, I have experience with depression or anxiety or whatever the case may be. So it's not as rare as you might think. You might not have been watching when they came forward, but they did. You know, even Prince Harry's name is on here. You know, talk about somebody with a lot of followers. There's a lot willing to take the risk. I think a lot of us can too. So with that, this last two slides, these are some QR codes of how to reach us on LinkedIn. In addition to, so I write a piece on LinkedIn. I publish every like 4 to 6 weeks or so, and it's all about accessibility and disability inclusion. That's the overall theme, but lately I've been empowered to be writing a lot more about mental wellness and conversations like today, because it's just needed now more than ever before. So to stay current on that, that's the best way to get there. And I think you have our emails too from the chat. And with that, I'd like, Bethany, do you have any final words before we pass it back over to facilitators and see what, if anything, we're going to do about Q&A?
Yeah, no, just a big thank you. I think this is a really important topic, and I really feel privileged to have been here today and part of this conversation. And thanks to you, Hale, for being such a great partner in putting this together. This has been a lot of fun.
Right back at you.
Thanks.
And so to our facilitators, I apologizing for not remembering precisely what to do next in terms of Q&A. So I'm looking for a signal of some kind. Let me just see if I'm getting a secret text. Standing by. Oh, you could also type questions in the chat if you haven't yet. And I see that some have already been asked and answered thanks to the facilitators.
Yeah, so I'll chime in here, Hale. So there's actually been quite a few questions in the chat that I believe we've sent most of the answers back. One of the big questions that keeps coming back is one, You guys are amazing today. This is, I wish we had another hour
Thank
of
you.
two of you, to be honest. A lot of the individuals on the call are asking if they're going to get a copy of this recording and of this presentation. The answer is yes. Once the Disability in Wisconsin Summit is over, we will be packaging that up and decide how we send that out to everybody. So this will be coming. You won't get it right away, not right when we end for today, but it will be coming out to everybody. But definitely, if you guys have questions, if there's additional questions right now in the chat, feel free to send them as well. Take a look here. And it looks like we have no additional questions that haven't already been answered.
Great.
Okay.
So great stuff, everybody. Definitely appreciate everybody here. And if you have any questions about Disability In or want to learn more about what we do, definitely reach out to us at info@disabilityinwisconsin.org. We also will be sending out a survey about this session. So definitely we want to hear your feedback. All right. Thanks, everyone. The session has ended.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.